Welcome to Learning South Africa's Languages, the podcast where we interview learners, teachers, and researchers of South African languages. I'm your host, Michael James, and in this episode, we'll be delving into the life and language learning journey of Cullen Mackenzie, aka uMabengwane. Cullen is a scholar and practitioner of languages, consulting on everything from indigenous languages and dictionary creation to curriculum development, archival research, and social media marketing. He's also the author of Ukutintana, a science fiction novel written in isiZulu. In this episode, we explore the fascinating story of his early life, centered on his experience growing up in a bilingual household in Eshowe, KwaZulu-Natal. His home environment was one where English-isiZulu bilingualism was normal and celebrated, leading him to learn isiZulu from both his biological parents and his non-biological family, for example, Mam'Ntuli. Cullen's journey takes us through a multilingual convent school, his discovery of Latin's structured elegance, and his pioneering high school class that studied isiZulu as a first additional language. Guided by an excellent teacher, Cullen transitioned from intuitive knowledge to systematic fluency, deepening his love and understanding of the isiZulu language. You can check out the episode notes to find out more about Cullen and links to topics mentioned in the interview. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, cool. Well, thanks, Cullen. How did Zulu enter into your life, or how did you enter into Zulu?
Okay. So one Michael. I think it's a big question because I've been aware for quite some time that my apprehension of the language is not unique, but it is different. I grew up, and this is the way I always answer this, whether the person's asking me in isiZulu or they're asking me in isiNgisi, I always talk about where I grew up. I start and I say, ngakhulele Eshowe. And anyone who knows KwaZulu would know that that phrase, which is translated as I grew at the place of Eshowe or Ekowe, depending on which dialect you wish to speak. And that is the last kraal or the last palace of Petwayo. That's where he had his last homestead. So I grew up there in the heartland. That's one answer. There are two.
Okay.
The second one is I grew up in a fully bilingual household. And more than that, in a playfully exploratory linguistic class where language was a game, language was a thing that we could enjoy. It wasn't something, there wasn't the pedantry that I see in so many English-speaking households. So that was interesting. Yeah, so those are the two answers.
Okay, I'd like to dial into the second one because I don't know, maybe both are equally important, but that's at least one which obviously your early life was formed by presumably your parents, right? And they created that playfulness with language. So what was it about them that led them to be those kind of people that then raised you in that way?
Cool. So the first thing to add is njengoba ngingumAfrika, abazali bami baningi. So as an African person, my parents are not two, they're many. So my biological parents, I'll speak about them first, and then I will speak about my other mothers and fathers.
Okay, sure.
So my father, uMashinashina Gambia Zolkosha is his name in isiZulu. It's Maurice Mackenzie. I am the fifth generation of us to live here in South Africa. And we came from Ireland and Scotland and settled in Carcliffe. And my father was born in 1936. And he is the youngest son of his parents. And when he was born, my biological grandmother suffered from postnatal depression. Now, 1936, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of understanding of that. So she was sent to Town Hill, to the mental hospital. Okay. And ubaba wanceliswa uMam'Ntuli. It's so much easier to explain it in Zulu. So my father was was sent to Mam'Ntuli as to be his wet nurse.
Okay.
And it's quite interesting. There's an idiom in Zulu. If you say a person speaks it as though it is their first language, "Kusengati wasnela," it's as though you suckled it from the breast. So, which for me, that's how my father got it. He was loved and accepted and at home among AmaZulu, and he stuttered in English. He still does.
Okay.
Didn't like it. Didn't like white society very much. So that's his story, and it goes on far beyond that. But that's the start.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then your mom, yeah.
Yeah. So my mom, Ukanyisile Makemela, she's from up in Joburg, up here, where I live now. And when she finished school in 1963, she felt the spirit of the age and wanted to do something to help. And she went and started working with Women for Peace. This was her radicalizing moment, I believe they talk about in modern such things. And she was radicalized by women who would later become famous as members of the ANC Women's League and et cetera, Black Sash. And she started to learn isiZulu. Now, upper class daughter of this house here in Joburg, she goes and lives in Soweto and she learns isiZulu. And she twasses because she's called. So she actually twasses and becomes isangoma long before many of the fashionable ones lately. And then practiced like that for a long time and was always very much in touch with the herbal, mystical aspects of isiZulu. She then, in her later years, in about 1994, she began studying theology to become an Anglican priest. The point of all of this is that her isiZulu was very much the spiritual, social church, whereas my father, because he went into politics, and also in farming and working with people, it was again social, but not the spiritual. It was more the, like, what binds us together? How do we work that out? So I was a little child sitting there in church, listening to people speaking isiZulu, English, whatever languages, and the same in political gatherings. So I was just immersed constantly in language. So the playfulness is that, I think, yeah.
So your parents then took you into their respective context all the time, okay, and very much, it was almost just an extension of what they are in callings, that then you as their child would enter into those spaces and I guess gain access to them through the language. Did they intentionally also teach you, as in speak to you in isiZulu, or was it more that you just kind of basically you were surrounded by it, so truly immersed, and people addressed you in the language, you were listening to it all the time? Maybe, how did that happen?
So this is really, it's a lovely question. So my earliest memories, and I know that there are people have told me about what happened before this, but my earliest memories are of, and this is where my other mothers come in, of being on Mam'Ntuli's back and hearing her through her chest singing. Sorry, it makes me emotional. But so Mam'Ntuli's voice and Masbia and the other people who lived with us and worked with us on the farm, we were cooperative. My father was a very bad capitalist and a very bad farmer. But I remember that there was that beautiful, just natural flow of Mam'Ntuli spoke almost no English. That was never an issue. She was there my whole life. She was another mother. And we had so many people just around. So my mother's world was mostly women, and my father's world was mostly men. But whoever phoned the household would automatically expect to speak to me in whichever language they preferred. So as
Okay.
a little boy, so you're asking whether it was done intentionally. I have this fleeting recollection of my father telling me, uma kushayela ucingo, mphendule ngokuthi yebo baba, ngingakusiza ngani. So I remember him saying that, like, if someone phones and they're speaking Zulu, obviously, because he didn't need to say that, he's speaking in Zulu. Says it is appropriate that you respond by saying, yes, sir, how may I help? Okay. And it was, so there was those intentions. My family also had an oikolect, which I love these different definitions. So dialect, right? Oikolect, idiolect. So my family has an oikolect where we substitute words from Zulu for English words all the time. And so there was just I don't know if that was intentional, but it was part of the fun. And then what else? Oh, then my father, when we went to game reserves, he would switch to Zulu and describe things, particularly birds and indigenous knowledge. So he would, because he'd been taught this by Michael Bombela, because my father worked on rhino capture with Ian Player and Michael Bombela back in the 60s. So there's a lot. But so dad has the IKS, the Indigenous Knowledge Systems for Zulu. My mother learned it a different way from Izangoma and Ubungoma and Ubunyanga. So they would both, as we walked, usually, they would switch and talk about what this plant was, or what this animal was, or how significant this is. Or so there was an intentionality there. They were both much older, so they were actually, in terms of age, they were like grandparent age to me, which is why Mam'Ntuli was important.
Yes, yeah.
Mediating.
Okay. And I mean, do you ever remember while you were going on walks with them, and they were, talking about whether it be plants or animals or birds, maybe particularly early on, having questions about the language that they were using and not really knowing what they were saying, and then asking them? Because presumably by that stage, would you have responded in the language that they were using? Was that like a normal interaction?
So that's really interesting. I think that depending on the emotional temperature of the interaction, if it was a relaxed interaction between myself and my father, or myself and my mother, and there's a reason for that, then I would ask them to clarify, or I would point out, oh, that's a synonym of this word. So usually in the language. So if they would use, for example, let's say Nibiliga, and I was little, and I'd say like, Kotaba, Kutin, what does it mean? And he would say, Ugnibiliga, Kusho, Ugu Ugnipisa, Ugnipa. And I go, oh, Ugnipa, to get smaller. So we'd switch. So I'd make the link to a Zulu word that I knew already, then link it back across the barrier. They're not, the walls in my head are not very high, but they are there. I have to cross that barrier into English and say, okay, it's linked to this word now. Yeah.
Okay.
My mother always had a bit of a chip on her shoulder about Zulu because she learned it up here. And when she met my father in 1979 at the centenary of the Anglo-Zulu War, he openly laughed at her accent, which didn't earn him very many points, of course. So she always had that sort of like I think the frustration of an adult learner who knows that they don't have that instinct for, oh, this doesn't quite sound right. Oh, I need to align this. Oh, I need to change that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So did you grow up also then, because you're talking about noticing all sorts of fine differences of meaning, and then I guess you had like both English words and then Zulu words, but also different kinds of Zulu words. Did you notice your mom's idiolect versus your dad's and pick up on what kind of second language learner speech might look like?
Yeah. So that's a brilliant question. Yes, I did notice. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, but people understand my mum. They understand her. They understand dad, and sometimes they don't understand dad. because Dad's speaking such old school Zulu that sometimes there's this clash where a young person, particularly younger than me, is speaking to Dad. They're respectful. They call him Mam'Ntuli. But when he speaks back, they look at me and they go, and then I have to shift a few gears down and translate. So there was that sensitivity to nuance is something which I think led me to become a translator, because translation, I think many people think of as it's like a one-to-one thing. I think that's probably because of the rise of AI. It's completely false. And as a translator, one of the things I love the most is tinkering with the nuance until I get it just right. So when I was younger, I remember feeling conflicted. Oh, dad's being a bit crap about the way Mum speaks. Okay. And then she would let fly with some hidden insult that only a person from Soweto would know, and Dad would be red-faced and embarrassed. So they have skills. So my mum had tsotsi skills essentially, whereas Dad had old school Zulu.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. So there's what that did. As I said, I was conflicted. Then for a little while, I went the route of no, we must only speak pure Zulu. That's gone, because I realized that's elitist and stupid and has a whole lot of other ists associated with it that we don't need in the room. And then I'm able to look back at the way my mother spoke, or the way some of the people in Natal spoke, because I grew up with a bit of negative energy around Natal. Oh, upume Natal. Oh, awusakhuluma isiZulu. Isifanakalo kuphela. Okay, so that's the trick. If you're from Natal, you don't speak Zulu anymore. You actually just speak Fanagalo.
Okay.
So I've dispensed with that. I'm much more phenomenological. I've gone back to how I was as a little boy, which is I listen and I'm curious. I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting way to say that. Are you from? Maybe. Oh, okay, you're from there. Cool, great.
Okay. So do you have a bit of a mental book of trying to place people now based on the kinds of words and maybe even accents and inflections and elisions that they make?
Yeah, my hero, and this is very geeky, but I think my hero was probably Henry Higgins. And the way that in My Fair Lady, or actually if you go further back to the original, the Pygmalion, George Bernard Shaw, how in the opening scene, I don't know if you know the story, Henry Higgins, who's a professor of linguistics, and he's at the theatre in London in the 19th century, and he's bored, but they're standing outside at intermission, and as people talk, he just says Brighton, Bath, yes. Oh, Stratford. Oh, okay. And then he hears flowers. And he's like, oh, now that is an East End. And he goes over to the flower seller and they place a bet on whether he can fix her English so she can speak like a lady. So it's a whole long story. Why I'm telling you this is, I think, there's a mental book. And part of it is knowing, like at the beginning of our interview, actually in the conversation before, when you used nda as opposed to nga, and my brain immediately just went click, click, click. Oh, okay. This is like teta. Okay. Yes, whereas if you'd said, if you'd said nga, but then instead of, I'm just trying to think. There'd be little noticeable things. The dialect, when I'm down in KZN, my dialect shifts back to Eshowe. So it's very traditional. But it's also quite nasal. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I think I've got a sense now of, I guess, the fully bilingual household, as you put it, and the impact that had. I'd probably like to dive into all sorts of things there to kind of understand more. Did you have any siblings who also were you were growing up with, who also had a similar linguistic journey, or did they have different ones, maybe because they're older or younger?
So they did have very different ones, because we have a traditional Zulu family, in that there are my father had children with first wife, and my mother came with children, and then had children with him. So I'm the last of 7, and this is again something that it doesn't make sense to Eurocentric people. They always used to say, like, but those are your step brothers and sisters. So I'm like, no, they're my sisters and my brothers. They're my siblings. We have the same. We're in the same household. There's no reason. So did they all speak the same? No, they didn't have the same upbringing. My sisters, for various reasons, were sent to, they didn't come into my father's life until they were 7 and 3, which is long enough. But then they were sent off to boarding school quite a lot and didn't spend enough time in the house. But they did still speak, and they do still speak, particularly agricultural Zulu, which is fine. I mean, it works. And some medical Zulu, because my sister used to work at the vet in Howick, and everyone would call her and be like, come, please, Kumusha, translate here. We don't know what's going on. And then she'd listen and she'd speak, and she'd go, oh, okay. So hers is functional. It's pretty good. My brothers, oh gosh, Rodney speaks it fluently. He's about 65, so he's a lot older than me. Cannot write it, cannot read it. Don't ask him to do those things, but he speaks it beautifully, poetically. He's still there, Michael?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, great.
I heard you perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. So he still speaks it, and he still lives in Nottingham Road in Dwelini. So he actually speaks the kind of Moy River Notties dialect quite fluently, which has an influence on his English. So if you listen to his English has got a very nasal twang to it. It's very much that area. My other brothers, so Gregor is a physiotherapist in Ohio, and he still understands enough to speak to Dad, because that's the main person, because Dad will just switch and we have to follow. So Gregor will still speak to Dad. They all have Zulu names. Douglas is the youngest of the brothers, but he's still 25 years older than me. He was a farmer in Underberg, so his dialect emerged from Dad's one, which is Mshwati, and then moved to the kind of like a little bit of Hlubi aspects. Some Sesotho as well. So they all have what I think is the connecting thing here. Growing up with our father meant that we were alive to the possibility of language and play and learning things and accents and just amusement of language. He used to put on accents all the time, all kinds of accents. And he learned enough of languages to be able to swear or to tell jokes. So that's what he would do.
Okay, so, and this is not just Zulu, but other languages as well.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, because I know you also have studied others, including classical languages as well. So, would you say, because this was kind of a question I had, where did Zulu, as I wrote it, did Zulu lead to like a multilingual awareness and interest in more language learning, or was it all kind of in the mixture together? There was just a lot of focus on language at home, and it was like natural. So, was it nature or nurture?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think that everyone in my family naturally has a linguistic bent. Sometimes what that shows up as in people who are monolinguals is that they're poetic. So a monoglot who speaks only English can be the most poetic human on the world, on the whole planet. But that's just a sort of a frustrated polyglossia, I would say. So for me, what happened was I have these genes. Okay, my mother speaks French, English, and Zulu fluently. My father Zulu and English, and then could swear in about 5 or 6 other languages. Can understand if you speak Xhosa, but like a traditional Zulu man refuses. He will speak Zulu and he will listen. So for me, growing up there, I did have the nature, but the nurture was crucial, and I'm going to explain why. The church gatherings we went to were not just Zulu speakers.
Hmm.
They were Portuguese people. They were people who spoke French. There were some Afrikaans-speaking people. There was multilingualism in the church.
Hmm.
The political gatherings were also not just bilingual.
Hmm.
There was, I remember distinctly the first time I heard someone singing Nkosi Sikelel in all the languages. And we don't do that anymore. But there was, at one of the IFP celebrations, they sang it in every single one of the official languages. The third thing is where I went to school.
Okay.
I was at a desegregated convent school in Eshowe called Holy Childhood.
Okay. Holy
We were taught
Childhood.
by, yes, Holy Childhood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll try it. I want to do a bit of research on that because, so it was desegregated. When was this?
So that was, so my parents moved us to Zululand when I was 3 in 87.
Okay.
And I started school in 89. It had been desegregated since the early 80s.
Okay.
And as a result had been, pilloried and people threw rotten fruit, etc., that sort of stuff. But it was Eshowe, so everyone was a lot more chilled. It's very hard to get excited or worked up when it's that hot and humid. But essentially, that had been desegregated, and the school was almost entirely run by Franciscan nuns from the south of Germany and from Austria.
I wonder if I had a conversation with one of them. But anyway, carry on.
I hope you did. So I credit my true multilingualism to two people. One is one of these nuns, and her name is Sister Fidelis. She was amazing. She opened my mind to the fact that even if I didn't understand something, I could figure it out eventually, and I should just listen and enjoy it. She was a great fan. I think, like a lot of German teachers, particularly that I've encountered in Waldorf schools and elsewhere, there's this emphasis on just art, just like the craft of things, doing something beautifully, enjoying it. So they spoke German around me because I was in boarding from when I was 6 years old.
Okay.
So Sister Cornhilde and Sister Fidelis, and then the other sisters, they would speak Deutsch all the time. And that was not strange to me. I was like, oh, okay, cool. I understand what you're saying. I didn't process it consciously. That was after 2 years in kindergarten because I was too young to go on with other sisters, Sister Birgit. So Sister Birgit and Sister Cecilia. Yeah. Anyway, they were lovely.
Okay.
That environment was also one where I was in classes with kids who spoke lots of languages.
Okay.
And no one, not even once, said the thing that I've heard so much now in my work as a researcher in schools, which is, you must not speak that language in my class. Okay. No one said that to us. All languages were welcome. And that for me changed everything. Those first 5 years of school were, so 2 years of kindergarten and then 4 years of school, 2 years of kindergarten and then grade 1 and 2. That changed my whole makeup. Thereafter, I was just hardwired, I think, for learning language. Yeah.
Yeah, which I mean, it's interesting in many European countries, or most European countries, like that's just how people go through education. They kind of become hardwired through just extensive exposure to multiple. So while you were at the convent school then, you were obviously exposed to German, presumably just by hearing them speak, but then for those first 5 years or beyond, were you taught German as well? What other languages? Okay, so what was formally taught to you, and what did you just pick up on, like?
Well, this is such an interesting thing because I've thought about this so much. At this school, because it was the 90s, the early 90s, there was no kind of formal language policy anymore. So we did English with our class teachers. we didn't do Afrikaans. The nuns were just like, no, we don't need to. I was like, okay. And there's a story I must tell you later. We got into so many fights with the other local Afrikaans kids, but so they would just say, like, we're not doing Afrikaans, we're going to do English, and any space that we would have taken for Afrikaans, we will do drama. So we did plays and we did other things. No one attempted to teach us Zulu, and I can tell you this clearly because everyone who was at that school already spoke Zulu. There was no need to teach it. So whether you were from Sunnydale, which was the segregated colored and Indian township, or from the horrifically named Gezinzila, which was the township for people of African origin, or from Eshowe town, or from up at the farms, you all knew how to speak. So there was no need to teach it. Also, the nuns, I think, thought that they weren't the right people to teach it. So,
oh, that's so interesting. Why did everyone speak, particularly those who weren't so like colored in an Indian as well? What was, because I mean, that's another interest. Obviously, in my own research, I've focused on white South Africans, but I did branch out and have some interviews with some non-white, mostly colored South Africans, just to understand if their motivations for learning were slightly different, which often they were, which is really interesting. But I mean, it seems very rare now within the South African Indian community in KZN, or at least in Durban, like they'll be like, oh yeah, I know one guy in Phoenix and he can speak Zulu, but it's extremely rare. So is it because of Eshowe? Is there something about that place?
So there's two things. The first is, I mean, this we could talk about for eons, but when social class, status, legal status, and influence are equal, then the two groups can assimilate and interact. When that balance starts to shift, there's no longer friendship. There's no longer that equality. There's just that umona and resentment. So why I'm saying this is it's not something that's racial necessarily. It's actually got to do with, like, I mean, you could look at a place like Boston. You could say, okay, why are the Irish and the Italians no longer friendly with each other? Because the Irish climbed up through the police department and got into the city, and now they're in power. The Italians didn't. They got into the mafia as a generalization, and they went the other route, so now they're enemies. But the class, the rank, the position is different. So there's a differential. So that was a really academic, abstract way of looking at this. I and my peers at Holy Childhood Convent all spoke isiZulu because the isiZulu speaking people in our classes were equal to us completely. We visited them, they visited us. We went to birthday parties, they came to our birthday parties, we went on trips together. It was one of the things which I've realized is very specific to Catholic education. There's that sense of you're all universal. No one's different. You can just, we will love you, you are children, you need education. So I think one thing that's very different about Eshowe was that back then, if you were going to the convent school, how do I put this? You're probably one of the white people who are still here.
Okay. No, I get you. So that school, going to that school represents something about the people who send children to that school. And okay. And I mean, there are schools like that around the country where, like, for instance, I think in Cape Town, if you were like a white liberal or something like that, and you know, an anti-apartheid activist, and you had children, you'd maybe send them to Westerford or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is in Eshowe there were so there was the convent school, there was the township school, there was the school in Sunnydale, and then there was the white kids school, government school down the road. And it wasn't like this place was some kind of Eden. I just need to make this clear.
Sure.
Because my father, torn between his desire to just not give a shit about white values and his desire to somehow fit in and maybe get the white people on his side, sent us to Cubs, my brother and I. Now, Cubs is like the most colonial institution on the planet. It's like precursor to Scouts, Baden-Powell, Empire, etc. Do your best. And so I went along, and my brother Tom, he was very into the whole outdoors thing. I'm not. I'm a book person and an academic person. But we went to a few meetings. But unfortunately, at one evening, some of the townies, because we lived outside town, some of the townies were there, and they started flooking us. So my brother Tom flooked them back, and in Zulu. Then it escalated. Then he beat the crap out of them. And I'm just watching this because I've always been a pacifist. So I just look at this, I'm like, there must be another way to solve this, but Tom seems to be enjoying himself. I think that sort of shows the dissonance between our family and a lot of the other white families in the area. Okay. But it wasn't all like that. It was very common. I think the way I said it earlier was to have a kind of functional fluency or an agricultural Zulu. It's very, very common for anyone living in what's now called, Eshowe is in the King Etwayo district. Yes, so it's very common to meet anyone who's there who would be able to speak a little bit of Zulu at least, but to speak it to the depth where one can write it, that's always a trick. So, yeah.
Sure, yeah. Which also probably indicates that there was some kind of commitment to go deeper. And yeah, so there was a question that was on the tip of my tongue, but I've lost it now. But so we've got into the school that you go into, and you described kind of the first 5 years. What happened after you went, presumably high school? Did you take Afrikaans, like the story of so many white South Africans who would take Afrikaans even if they wanted to take Zulu, and the school would dissuade them? It much depends on the school you went to, but yeah, what happened next?
Cool. So let's go. Right. So 1993 was my last year at the convent. It's also, anyone who knows anything about history or actually lived through it, 1993 was an interesting year, to put it that way. And for anyone who was involved with IFP, yeah, very bad year. In 1994, we moved schools, and my father took us to Clifton, Nottingham Road. It was awful. It was awful. It was like a wrench, because now I no longer had, at least Mam'Ntuli came with us, but no one else did. All of the sisters gone. And they spoke this weird Zulu, this Ndulini Zulu, this dusty Natal Zulu, and they called everyone Nkosana. And I was like, huh? Who's Nkosana? And my father would have loud arguments in Zulu with people and say, Angsiyo inkosi yakho. I'm not your inkosi. Why are you calling me Nkosana? So that was an issue. But at school, I hid. I found my friends in the kitchen and in the ground staff, and I just went there. I was either there or I was in the library.
Were you a boarder at the school as well?
Full boarder. Okay. Yeah. It was a 3.5 hour drive from Eshowe to Clifton. So we were full boarders. We hardly ever saw parents. This is my brother Tom and I. We were close in age. And what language did I choose? Yeah, it's a good question. So they did offer Zulu, which was amazing. Okay. Yeah. And they offered, so they had this amazing thing. They said, well, we've got Zulu, we've got Afrikaans, we've got Latin. I was like, oh, that's fantastic. We might have some French, but that gap student might go somewhere else, so we don't know. So I was like, oh, great. This is awesome. Because already I think I knew. I think I knew that my particular thing was language.
Okay.
Because I'd already started like writing stuff and translating stuff, and my favorite thing to play with was always the multilingual inserts in the toys, not the actual toys. Give me the instruction booklet. I'll read the shit out of that. Okay, so yeah, Geek Central, and all this was offered, and so I went to the first Zulu class. This is now, I'm in grade 3. I'm still little. We moved halfway through primary school, which is awful. So I'm in grade 3. This is usually when, this is your last year of having your monolingual education, unless NTBBE really takes off, but that's another topic for another day, I think. And I went to the first Zulu class, and the Zulu class was being taught by the nursing sister, a white nursing sister. And I was like, okay, I'm open to this possibility that she might know what she's doing. She didn't.
Okay.
She was learning the night before and then regurgitating to us in the day. So I was like, no, I actually speak this language and this is irritating me. So I went and did Afrikaans, hated it. Because I hadn't done it. So I was on the back foot. I hadn't done it at early childhood. And they're like, no, Afrikaans is easy. You can pick it up. I was like, okay. Also, my father had, let's say, quite strong feelings about the language, which didn't help. Because now I've realized that I love it, especially Noord-Kaapse Afrikaans. In the Afrikaans van Eshowe in Kirkwood. My Afrikaans is, yeah, baie lekker.
Okay.
But in that time, I did this Afrikaans with Langtana, and I was struggling, and I really didn't enjoy it. But when grade 4 came around, I took Latin. Okay. Now, just remember, I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
Okay. Normal 10-year-olds don't do this, but there were 4 of us in this class. And I can't even begin to describe you how much I loved Latin. It was soothing, it was logical, it was all there, everything made sense.
What is your relationship to mathematics?
Well, I had a really good maths teacher at the convent, and she was fantastic. She was Sister Fidelis that I was telling you about.
Yes.
And then I skipped grade 3. Sorry, so actually I was in grade 4 when I was at Clifton. Skipped grade 3. So I skipped basic subtraction, multiplication, division. And I've never been the same since. So I feel like I've missed the gap. But I have since learned, because I love Latin and Greek so much, of course I'm a mathematical person. And it's helped me to sharpen up my understanding of isiZulu. So
yeah, that's a seemingly a common thread. I mean, I've spoken to many people who are learning quite bookish ways of learning isiZulu.
Yes.
In this case, and the algebraic metaphor comes up.
Yeah, it really does.
As it did for me as well when I first encountered it. I mean, kind of very late in my life, at least given how old I am. So okay, interesting. And so then you started taking Latin, and that's grade 4, which is but ridiculous. Very cool.
Yes.
And what happened from then on?
There was like an explosion in my brain. I suddenly, and it's something which I've seen in students I've taught, when they reach a threshold. There's like, you've got the structures of 2 languages. That's awesome. Here's a 3rd one. It doesn't just add, it kind of exponentially, it changes the way a person can perceive any language. So I think that there's so much to be said for exposing children to language as early as possible, because this rubbish that people talk about, saying that many languages will confuse the child, that's rubbish. The child's mind is more powerful than any adult's mind and can differentiate between those things so easily. So for me, I think that what happened when I did Latin, because it was like putting a steel frame into a foundation and then pouring the cement over it. Whenever I needed to learn a new language, I had that frame. And because I didn't just have European languages, and this is, I think, the difference between me and a bunch of other people who can pretty much only learn European languages, because I'd had Zulu so strongly, I was able to merge those two frames, which means that like my understanding of the classical languages is influenced by the way I understand Zulu and vice versa. So, yeah.
Now I remember you reminded me of someone I interviewed who we won't mention. I don't know if you worked it out. But she told me that you were geeking over the Grammar Visigosa by J.C. Oosthuizen. And now I understand that there's a lot of echoes in what you're saying, because obviously he grew up kind of in a very kind of deep Xhosa environment, learning as a, from the breast, or, as a mother tongue. And that's what he explicitly almost tried to do, was figure out the grammar from a non-Eurocentric kind of perspective, which was interesting reading it as someone who hadn't had your experience, because it didn't seem all that different from there were clearly things, he was borrowing grammatical concepts that had been applied to the language, which arguably would have been derived from, cognate terminology and European grammars and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it felt extremely coherent. But I was mostly focused on just the example sentences, to be honest, because they were so interesting. But now I understand why I was told that you really enjoyed that, because he was probably making some moves there which you resonated with.
I really do. Yeah, I love it when I find, and it's not such a small group that we can't give it a name, but like a Sintu classicist, basically. Someone who approaches the language in the sense of, this can be known, this can be mapped out, this does make sense, but it makes sense from within. It's the way that when I first encountered Latin, the way it was taught was so perfectly suited to it. I was like, oh, someone's actually designed this so that when you teach it, you also teach the way of the language, not just the words. And I know that rubs people up the wrong way. They're like, why did we have to learn declension tables and conjugations? And why do we have to learn the 15 different uses of the ablative, etc.? But actually, that's part of the reason why the languages and the culture was the way it was. The same thing is true for my later learning of any of the languages I've done, is that the key is either I've got two pathways to learn something deeply. One is I try to find the source code. So like you were saying, a really good, thorough, endogenous grammar. So grammar written from within. Okay. Someone preferably who's like me, who stands with a foot in either world. If I can read one of those with example sentences, I'll understand most of the time. The other way is, if there are no books available, which happened when I worked for 3 weeks in southern Malawi, I just turn on maximum ukuzwa, just listen, feel, perceive, mimic. So then I just become a little child again. So for me, there's either the very academic approach or the very organic approach. Those are my options.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm aware of the time. We should probably finish up in around 20 minutes max, and then have time afterwards. So I'm not sure how much we'll get to more general sociolinguistic stroke language policy stroke whatever.
Because then we'll be here a lot longer. Yeah,
we will be here a lot longer. Yeah. Okay, maybe let's finish your schooling. And so maybe what I'm expecting to hear, but I don't know, is that you took Latin, but then once you reach high school, Zulu was also available and then you took it formally then, and you probably disliked aspects of it because you're probably way better than you needed to be. But nonetheless, it gave you an opportunity to really just systematize your knowledge. So that's my hypothesis. What actually happened?
That's remarkably accurate. Nice. So you missed a couple of languages on the way, but we'll do that. That's fine. We'll just fill it in. So Latin lasted until the end of primary school.
Okay.
And then I left and had a year and a half at a school in between in Pietermaritzburg, while my father was in Parliament and my mother was at the cathedral, the Anglican cathedral. So I was at this school and they offered Zulu and it was shite again. So I was like, no thanks, not interested. I will use this opportunity. Instead of just resting on my laurels and knowing I could pass, I'll use the opportunity to learn something new. French. Awesome.
When was this? This was grade 8 and 9.
Yeah, so 1996, 1997, I took French. And I continued with Afrikaans, hating it, absolutely hating it, but still doing it. And thinking, well, I could do Zulu, but every time I walked past the Zulu class, it was so bad that I was just like, no, I just can't do this. This would just hurt too much. Because I have such strong emotional connections to the languages I speak. They're not here, they're here. They're in my heart. So if someone messes them up, it hurts. Not that, so like, I'm not saying dialects hurt, but people erring.
Yes.
So I loved French. God, it's so beautiful. And I still have contact with that French teacher, Madame Piel. She's amazing. She taught it again in the indigenous way, the way that the French have worked out. This is how we teach les étrangers. We teach them le français, like this, comme ça. And she taught it beautifully. She was also a full bilingual, like me with Zulu. So her mother spoke French, so she spoke French, and her father spoke English, so she spoke both of them. So she was a role model for me of someone who was like, her accents didn't even bleed into each other. She had a flawless French and flawless English. So, right, then the trauma, good trauma, got a scholarship to go to that place up on the hill near Pietermaritzburg that people know of, Hilton. And on the table offering was Afrikaans. No thanks, not interested anymore. isiZulu, taught by Mnumzan Evan Brown, Mlungu, Jengam. So I was like, okay, I'm going to give this one last chance. One last chance. I'm going to go and sit in and see what it's like. So I sat there and he played. He was curious. He was interested. He was giving us nicknames. We were talking about cattle colors. We were reading poetry. We were listening to music. It was suddenly what first additional language or even home language was supposed to be like for me.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'd felt so alienated in those other classes because it felt like they were doing this kind of weird sideshow tourist thing of my language. And I didn't want to take part in that. Like, that's what is this? What is this thing that you think you're doing? It's not the language I grew up with. So Mnumzan Brown was incredible. I stayed with Zulu from grade 9 to matric with him. And it gave me an opportunity to be affirmed in the way I was speaking, because my accent hadn't changed. I hadn't picked up the Natal one. So I still spoke like I was from Eshowe. And the kitchen staff and the ground staff loved it because they're like, you speak like my granddad, but you know, you're a kid. So also because my father's Zulu is from 1936. So it's like, there was some archaisms that I used, but that's the way I speak English too. So, and so French, I did for the rest of grade 9, but then I had to do stupid subject choices. And I wanted to do history and French and art. those were all on the same line because boys' schools being what they are. So I did history, which, stood me in good stead. And then just carried on the rest of high school with Zulu and teaching myself Latin because I hadn't been able to find another teacher.
And continue with French, presumably, as well.
Yeah, myself. So I'm most of my languages, apart from Latin and Greek, which I actually have degrees for, the rest of them I'm an autodidact. So I don't, yeah.
And I'd love to also just talk about, I guess, the ways that you have done your autodidacticism. So, yeah, especially with literature, but we don't have time for that because I'll just dangle it there because I'd love to hear your anecdotes on this. I'm sure you have. I'm a big fan of Tolkien, and I guess his world, Silmarillion, and Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. So there was a time when I was German. I in effect got all my favorite books in English. Found translations in German, and I started to do the same thing in French as well. So I have quite a few Tolkien books in French, and like a lovely 3 set of The Lord of the Rings in German and Silmarillion. And also I started like a kind of a translation project into Xhosa of The Smith of Wootton Major. I don't know if it's a small novella.
I do. Yeah. That's wonderful. Wow.
But it's for me, and similarly also with the Bible, which I'm quite familiar with just from, forever, which is at least one book that I can easily find in African languages.
Yes.
But all these others, it's really difficult. So earlier also when you mentioned drama, okay, I'm going to end my tangent now, but I was having a conversation with a Swiss-French but very Americanized linguist who learned Xhosa over the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah. And he's only been in South Africa 2 weeks under Professor Zoliswa Mali. I'm not sure if you've encountered him at Boston University. And he said apparently she was using Julius Caesar, a translation of Julius Caesar in Xhosa as part of the teaching materials. And I was like, wow, that exists.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Anyway.
Cool. So what you're talking about for me, I always call Rosetta texts.
Okay.
So the Rosetta texts are crucial. And I left out a piece of my story. So I talked about the fact that I was in church a lot. I was an altar server. I was a boat boy. If no one knows what that is, a boat boy does not mean I hung around boats. It means that I held the little thing, the container of incense that was going to be put into the thurible, the incense thing for the thurifer to swing. So there's a lot of downtime when nothing was happening. But I could read from when I was very little. And so I would sit and read side by side the Bibles, because we had a Zulu one and an English one in the pews, or the prayer book, which was also translated. So those are crucial. Yeah.
Prayer book as well. It's just such a great resource because it's got like the questions, imibuzo, and like just it's a very different kind of language to much of the rest of the prayer book. But I mean, and it's so awesome that it's actually really easily available. But again, you have to be sufficiently willing to read the prayer book as a language learner, which not all people have. But if you are willing, it's just such a great resource.
I think my modern encounters with most of my students up here are neurodivergent, and they have pointed out to me that I have certain traits which might be associated with autism. One of them is the fact that I have read dictionaries cover to cover. That's what I do. I still do it. Now I get paid to do it by some people. But I remember distinctly reading the Oxford Concise because I was like, okay, English, it's on. I'm gonna read you. I'm gonna know you. So I did. So I read it cover to cover. And to this day, if you want a partner for quiz shows, I'm really good on etymologies and things. I'm sure you are too. But I've done that with almost every single language I've learned. That's one of the techniques I use, is I find a good dictionary. And I'm not messing about here. The translators' dictionaries, I kill them very quickly because they're not very user-friendly. So like the Shooter and Shooter Nyembezi is a one-to-one translation equivalent thing. There's no example sentences. Nightmare. I can't. That's just like I have to make so many connections. Whereas the Doak and Vilagazi is beautiful. Read that cover to cover. That's amazing. Same thing with the Hachette, the Francais, and I've also the first thing I do if I want to learn a language is I get a dictionary.
Okay.
So I guess that's my go-to. Second thing is I find some music, listen to that, because books can't give me the musicality of the language I love. And I pretty much fall in love with every language I hear. If you let me listen to it long enough, I'll be like, oh, I think that's probably a noun. It keeps coming at the end of a sentence. I wonder if that's a thing. So I immediately start to decode it. So yeah.
And I mean, that's what it's fascinating that you were doing this as a boat boy, like when you were 6. Was that when you?
Six,
I mean, my own experience of it was mostly with. Actually, I did it with German first, but then I used the same method with Xhosa, was just reading the New Testament. I didn't really do it side by side, but just because I'm familiar with it in English, and what you then start to do is, be familiar with so many of the stories, and like you pick up on individual words, and then you can start to decode both grammar as well as vocabulary, and you get so much for free in the process. And yeah, so I can kind of see how that works. I forgot why I was talking about that, but
there's something that occurred to me while you were talking, which might help you. Ironic mental processes, of course. I think one of the key things, the key mindsets that I had from an early age regarding language was not understanding everything is not a problem. In fact, confusion or not knowing precisely, consciously what is being said opens the door to another kind of understanding. And I don't know, maybe that's just me being weird, but I feel like the moments when I have had no other resources available to me but my own mind, and I've been working as an interpreter. I mean, there's one story. I accompanied a Jesuit priest. This really does sound like an Indiana Jones adventure, but I accompanied a Jesuit priest to the Fatima mission near Mbangeni for the pilgrimage. He was going there to speak to them about some initiative that the Catholic Church had, and he wanted me to be his interpreter. Now, I've only interpreted 3 times in my life. It's exhausting in the best conditions. And we ended up doing our act at 3 a.m. After a full evangelical service, people getting possessed, all kinds of stuff. Very interesting. And so then we do our speech. And I just remember thinking at that point, all right, I can't even access my frontal cortex right now. So I'm just going to close my eyes and let the sound come in, and I'm just going to be a vessel or a conduit for this thing. So it was almost like inspiration, or possession, but not quite. It was more like I have to switch off my conscious mind in order for me to fully access all of the languages I have. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Interesting. You're reminding me of, there's a book by she's Hungarian, Kato Lom. I'm not sure how to pronounce her surname, but she was where I got the idea for reading, and for learning languages through reading. But one of the main things she said was, do not use a dictionary, do not look up the words while doing it. Just underline them if they start to irritate you. And they'll only irritate you if you notice them. And if you notice them, it means there's a reason you're noticing them, and it's because they are reoccurring multiple times, or they seem important, and your brain is picking up on that. So that whole kind of intuitive process of deriving what is important and what is not. And so she recommended, just read. And then if you underline it, that's the one that you must go look up. But don't do it now. Just carry on reading. Just give it a go. Let your brain will do it. And that was freeing for me, because I think when you brought up in a way where you need to know everything, and kind of this commitment to there being, well, there needs to be a one-to-one, and we can't leave any of these things hanging. It was really freeing, and also it actually gave me, well, I didn't tire of the language learning activity as quickly as I would have had I been breaking the activity all the time. So anyway, it's kind of similar to.
Yeah, I really like that example. I think that for me, when I think about it, I'm very comfortable working with a dictionary. But as I've got older, I've realized that the dictionary is itself a gatekeeper. Because I may need to, if I'm going to use it, I will use it in the richest way possible. I will really go in there and read it as though it is something like a poem or something that I need to learn. But the points where I've had nothing else at my disposal except me, that's where I've truly become multilingual. When I'm comfortable and I have a dictionary, there's no pressure for me to go further. So when I was on holiday in France with my sister, or no, in Italy, and we reached this funny little albergo in Eshowe near Genoa, and my Italian's not fantastic, but at that moment, I knew exactly what we needed to say. I could order all the things. We got in. I apologized. I was the politest young man ever. And the woman who ran the hotel and her husband, they provided us with like 6 courses of food because I'd obviously said the right thing. So what I'm saying is there's a switch, but it has to be accepting that I know nothing, accepting that consciously, my conscious mind is not going to help. I have to just feel what the answer is. And I'm going to say this really bluntly, a lot of English-speaking white people are very uncomfortable with feeling stupid. And so that's why they don't learn African languages, because it requires you to be comfortable with sounding like an idiot quite often.
Yes, yeah. Hey, shucks, man, the time is disappearing quickly. On that point, I encountered people saying similar things a few times in my research, and I can't remember when. I think it was I was reading something about Eastern Orthodoxy, but they have this theological concept of kenosis. Maybe it's, I mean, it's obviously from kind of Greek, but just self-effacing and a process, but it's like it's for the good, and it's like this is the self-humbling, and I guess the feeling stupid might come along with that, and a willingness to do it. But that's crucial for success in language learning, and some people feel that like worse than others. Other people embrace it indeed as part of the reason they do it, because they feel like this is the process of making good, and which is just interesting. But whatever the motivations, it seems universal, and you have to embrace it if you want to master a language.
I think that's what it ends up becoming is I open myself and empty myself out, which is the kenosis. I empty myself out and become a vessel into which the language can pour. That doesn't mean that the other languages disappear. I think that once I'd done it, I think once I'd learnt French and then Latin, or Latin and then French, I'd kind of worked out that there was a way to do it, and that was the way. So then as an adult, learning Xhosa was super easy, but it was very weird for my colleagues because I just became a little child, and they were like, "What? But you're the M&E person. You're like the manager. You shouldn't be." I was like, "No. How did you learn language? Did you sit in a class with your glasses on, taking down notes in a pen? No. You learnt it as a child from listening, from watching, from repeating, and that is the essence of it. But it's the humbling. It is a bit like Zen, a little bit like Zen.
Yes, yeah. And so much of our education system pushes us towards, I guess, being an adult, not being a child.
Yeah.
So childlikeness is almost to be appreciated as opposed to childishness. And if only we could rehabilitate maybe that distinction for language learning, would be great. Okay. Maybe what we can finish just before we end. So this will be the final one. So I've got three questions. They're all related. Your experience of Zulu in high school, and you mentioned that your teacher was the right teacher for you, and that was kind of a trauma in my mind. The catastrophe came up. It was like a good disaster.
Yes.
But so, what was your experience of classmates and that process of learning? Was it very much a thing where it was really your teacher was perfect for you and you were, far ahead of everyone else, or was there symbiosis between you and your classmates as well? And then I'm just curious about your teacher's background and what made him, playful and the right teacher.
Great, thank you. So, all right. First thing, we were the guinea pig group at our school for first additional language Zulu. This was a new concept. It was like 1997. Everyone was like, what is this FAL thing? Is it not second language? Is it, what is it? So there weren't very many of us. There was Ndozonke Mkhize, who is a Zulu speaker, but an orphan. So his parents hadn't raised him. He'd been in boarding schools. Then there was, I'm remembering all the names now. This is very funny. So Upoti, Mbiza was his nickname. Then there was Eshowe, who was Fanikak. Then there was, you can see these names are lovely. There were so many. The head boy in our year, Karabo Mukwape, was, I don't remember what his nickname was, but he was also in the Zulu class. What I'm saying by telling you all this story is that class was affirming, not because he was the perfect teacher for me, he was the perfect teacher for this group of what we now call aging millennials, I guess, who were thrown together in a class where suddenly there's an Indian kid, there's a Zulu kid, there's an exile kid whose father was on Robben Island, there's a white Jewish kid from Durban, okay? There's me, with all my background. There's a farmer's kid from Moy River. We have all these different backgrounds. There's someone who's like a white liberals kid from Joburg, okay, etc. So they're all doing Zulu. We're all in this class. And I knew that I had a natural ear for the music of the language. I left out the bit that I was in choir, so I always used to sing. And I think the worst thing that a Zulu speaker can be is tone deaf. So so I had the ear for the music. Yeah,
it's ridiculous how many people I speak to who have been successful with African languages are in choirs or musical training. Anyway, please continue.
So what's really interesting is, okay, so I found my place in the class. He knew who I was because he'd asked me. He was interested. He was the way he was because he was a cattleman. So he had done what a few white people had done, which is they'd not cared for the way that apartheid had separated people because their ancestors had always lived together. So the Browns and the local Zulu people had always just lived in the same area. They were not the big kind of industrialized, commercialized farming operation. It was always small. And they understood the cattle. And I think that is a shortcut into a Zulu person's heart. So Mnumzan Brown was fluent, but he wasn't just fluent. He had love for the idioms of the language. He used them effectively. He was also quite comfortable saying he didn't know. So if there was a question and he'd never heard that word before, he'd say, "Hey, angas." And there I'd be with my dictionary. I'd be like, "Yeah, okay." And so it was an experimental class. So that was in the favor. Each of us had our roles. We all played different things. No one was particularly useless. I was sometimes top of the class, but sometimes I messed it up because I'd never had the grammar training, and the grammar that the IEB was looking for was very different from grammar I'd grown up with, and I hadn't kind of worked that out yet.
Was there a healthy competition?
Yes, there was. And Dozonke and I quickly realized that we were friends because we didn't need to fight with each other, because we're the only two in the class who actually spoke the language regularly outside class.
Okay.
Danny was my rival though. Yo, because Danny was a mathematical kid, and he looked at Zulu and was like, I'm gonna algorithm my way out of this shit. So he did. He got top marks. He got like 95 for paper 1. Paper 2, not a chance. He would get like 60s. Because composition, creativity, that kind of stuff, not there. But he basically just like, I'm going to just make this a memory game. So that's what he did.
Okay.
I didn't feel that there was a need for me to prove myself with it. I was like, cool, you do you. I already speak this language. It wasn't a sense of conceit. It was more a sense of, okay, I'm learning what I can here. And I did. I had the most beautiful task, because we only realized halfway through matric that we had to have a portfolio of evidence for IEB. This is Namzan Brown. I remember distinctly like losing his shit one day and being like, oh, no, bang, katas. Okay, they're just full of shit. So, and he said, okay, we're going to have to do this really quickly. So we had to do all our portfolio tasks in a month. And I remember just sitting down and almost bursting into tears and then thinking, no, actually, I'll remember. And I wrote out an Ingalegwane that my father had told me when I was little. And I wrote it out fully and added in some different things, and I practiced it. And that was my oral prepared speech.
Okay.
And that was the moment where I felt like, oh, actually, this is what I love. I love the writing.
Interesting. Okay. That's a good juncture probably to end, because I'm also, keen to continue talking about various other topics. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Learning South Africa's Languages. If you enjoyed what you heard, let us know in the comments section or via social media, and please share this with someone you know would be interested in it. If you know anyone who'd be a great guest, please reach out. You can also follow Language Learning SA, which publishes this podcast, on all the main social media sites. Our aim is to centralize information, media, and resources to help learners of South African languages. If you found resources, media, teachers, or schools, or something that helped you or somebody you know, let us know and we'll be sure to add it to our database. Thanks for listening.